Yeah, it seems the life is private.
Oh, okay. Hi, grade school fam. If I'm live, if you can see me, hang tight. I want to make sure that that's the case. Let me check this out here. Let's see. One moment. So, Rafa, you're saying that the link that I just posted is private?
Yeah,
Okay.
I cannot access.
Let's see. Oh, okay. Okay, I think I've fixed it. I think I was indeed talking to nobody, except all those people in the future who are going to watch this video. Hello,
All
future
right,
selves.
that's perfect.
Okay, is that working now?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay. Well, I'll give everyone a chance to find the posts, to see the updated link, find their way in. This is really weird. I'm in my new configuration here. Hi, everybody, if you're finding your way in. Sorry about the confusion. We got lots of stuff happening here on the YouTube channel, and we're figuring out the new rhythm. How do you like the new set? Is this good? If you can believe it, this is exactly where I'm always standing. You're just looking at me from the side instead of from the front. So I don't know if I have I think both of my sides are bad, but maybe this is my less bad side. Good morning. Hi, how's it going? I see y'all finding your way in here now. Okay, there we go. And yes, Jim is totally right. No reminders. Sorry about that. Oversight this week on my part. We'll get it tuned up going forward because we're going to be doing this in this new rhythm every week and just figuring out the new flow. What's going on, guys? How the heck are you? How's your week been? Who was here with me this morning for my LUT workshop with Blackmagic Design? Any of you lunatics crazy enough to hang out with me for 3 hours in one day? If not, you missed a good time. We were talking about the fundamentals of LUT with Blackmagic Design. I do these workshops periodically with Blackmagic Design, totally free of charge. The LUTs one is a good one. I do one on DCTL. I do one on color management that is coming up in the next few weeks here. So I'll leave some links and you guys can check out those in the future if you would like to join. And if you were there this morning, then I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I hope we are going to cover a whole new territory of color grading stuff today. Today we're talking about node trees, and specifically we're talking about questions and sort of details and nuance following my video that came out earlier this week on the use of node trees and on some of those types of nodes that we were talking about there in the video. So that's what I want to focus on for today. And I hope we have lots of questions and lots of ideas to explore. It seemed like everyone was really interested in the topic as we were discussing it in the video. But as we're all finding our way in and figuring out where the links are and making sure they're unprivate and all that stuff, I'm going to start just by addressing a question that came up a few times this week when we started talking about parallel nodes. Because parallel nodes, we talked about the basic function where it's like, okay, if I have, whatever here on shot number 2, if I do a couple serial nodes and I do a couple things there, and then I start to add a parallel node, which I can do by hitting Option P, separate and distinct from a layer node, because a layer node is going to be highly dependent on the sequencing of this vertical stack, right? A parallel mixer doesn't care at all. So just easy example, if I do, like some big cooling adjustment up here, and I do some kind of like, I don't know, a contrast type thing down below, boy, this is oh wait, I should turn on my screen share, shouldn't I? Unless you just want to peer into the feed and look at my iMac screen. I don't think that's that cool of a move. All right, so here's what I was talking about before. I've got some serial nodes strung out, and then I created a parallel node stack right here. And what I was just starting to demo is within this parallel node stack, if I create some kind of crazy cooling operation and then some kind of contrast operation down below, these are going to be mixed together. And if I grab a still of this and I swap these so that the bottom is on the top and the top is on the bottom, and I wipe, exact same result, no different, right? So a parallel mixer does not care about hierarchy of layers in any way. All it's doing is mixing these nodes together in equal measure. And we had the question come up a couple times about, well, what's the actual math there that's going on? And I was glad to hear that question because that was something that puzzled me. And when I finally figured it out, that was one of the things that sort of like shook my thinking loose and made me say, maybe there's something to this whole parallel node thing. Because I know there were some of you guys asking about that this week. What made you a parallel node guy? You've always been a serial node guy. You've always been talking about how you only need serial nodes, and yet now I'm a parallel node convert. One of the reasons was simply getting a better grasp on the math and feeling like, okay, this isn't some mystery thing. I understand what it does. So let's take a look here. The parallel mixer, I can kind of give you the basic math of it. What it's going to do, let's take just the example that we have right here. We have feeding into this parallel mixer. Let's make things as simple as possible. Let's actually zero out these corrections on these nodes, okay? So we have an initial image. We're just going to call this node number 1, the results of node number 1, which is no different than the initial image as it was fed in to this node graph. We have the adjustment happening in node 3, and we have the adjustment happening in node 2 here. Okay, so those are our 3 sort of variables in play in the math expression that I'm about to give you. Okay, the math expression is as follows: node 3 plus node 2 minus node 1. That's how the parallel mixer works. Node 3 plus node 2 minus node 1. And if we make that slightly more complicated, something like this, the math would still be the same. Node 3 plus node 2 plus node 4 plus node 5 minus node 1. That's it. That's the way a parallel mixer works. That's how it does its magic of combining those 2 different branches in the case of what we were looking at in this week's video into one stream, regardless of the particular, like, you know, sort of like vertical hierarchy of those images. So that's how that works. And if you wanted to, you could actually construct such a node graph yourself. If we do something like this, I haven't actually tried this in a while, but let's give it a go. If we do, let's just say we want to do our sort of own homespun parallel mixer where we're going to do, I don't know, let's make it something simple so we can compare it with an actual parallel mixer. So we're going to do the home cooked version here. We're going to do some, oh, did I make a layer mixer instead of a parallel mixer? Yeah, let's make it a parallel. So we're going to do some contrast. Maybe. No, really. Morph into a parallel node. There we go. So we get some contrast going on. Down below, we'll do a cooling operation, kind of like I just did. So this is what it looks like with a parallel mixer. Let's see if we can recreate this now. I'm going to turn this back into a layer mixer. We're going to add these 2 together. So I'm going to set my composite mode to add. This is one of my favorite things about the layer mixer is it's actually a really great way to start to get a little more comfortable with image math in a highly visual context. Now, so that's all I'm doing here is using the add mode to perform arithmetic with the image. Okay, so I'm going to add node 3 and node 2 together. Now I'm going to do a new serial node, and I'm going to take the result of adding node 3 and node 2 together, and from it I'm going to subtract the original node 1. Okay, and when I do this, I'm going to go to my composite mode, and I'm going to say subtract, like so. And if I wipe from one to the other, identical images, right? So that's the math. You can see it now spelled out here visually. Add node 2 to node 3, take that result, and from it, subtract the original input image. Make sense? It's kind of cool, actually. It's pretty elegant. So that's a brief explanation into the math and how that works and how you could actually, if you for some reason wanted to, make your own parallel mixer node, you could do that here in Resolve. And that's actually something that I want to sort of emphasize or delineate in our conversation today is we have a category of, we have a list of types of nodes inside of Resolve, but there's actually 2 sort of categories within that list, okay? So parallel nodes and layer nodes, for example, those are nodes that are actually defined by a mixer. So these nodes are actually just plain old serial nodes. They're just being combined in a particular way, right? As we can see in this example. You could contrast that with some other forms of node, if we look at them here, where we have something like, I mean, really what's funny is pretty much everything is a serial node at its base layer. An outside node is a serial node with an alpha channel flowing from one node to the next. A parallel node is 2 serial nodes stacked, or 2 or more serial nodes stacked on top of each other being combined by a parallel mixer. A layer mixer is 2 or more serial nodes stacked on top of one another being combined by a layer mixer, right? A splitter combiner, which we didn't even talk about this week, that's 3 serial nodes stacked one on top of each other being created and then recombined by a splitter node and by a combiner node, right? So we tend to think of nodes as types, but really they're all the same type. It's what we're doing with them before or afterward that make it a parallel or a layer or a serial or a splitter combiner, whatever type of node we're dealing with. It's actually about how we are treating that node before and afterward, as opposed to the node itself having some other sort of property to it. I know we got kind of a strange start today, but any questions so far out there, Rafa?
We have one question from T. Wakate. Maybe just to recap, is the parallel mixer node equivalent to a layer mixer on the add mode?
No. So the simplest that we can do in terms of like, what we just did was recreating our parallel mixer with a layer mixer. There's no simpler way to go about that than to turn this into a layer mixer, stack up those operations, and then use a second layer mixer to subtract the original image from the result of that first layer mixer. That's the simplest that we can express the function of a layer mixer, or excuse me, of a parallel mixer as a layer mixer. So I'm going to set this to add and this to subtract. This is the simplest it can be. So it's not, parallel node is not equal to a layer mixer. It is doing something we can also accomplish with two layer mixers when they have the proper arithmetic being applied to the images using the composite mode, if that makes sense. What else? Empty out there so far?
Yeah, nothing else at this moment.
This is super weird, guys. What am I going to talk about with y'all? All right, let's talk about some other things that I thought were interesting based on this week's comments that also I felt like just didn't quite have room in the video to talk about. So here's another one that I'm going to talk about now. Let's do a quick kind of template node tree here. Like I showed in the video, like I always do. Exposure, contrast, balance, okay? And then we're going to do our parallel pipe, which again, just to recap, this is feeding in from that leftmost goalpost as opposed to from the output of my primary nodes. And let's go ahead and do some, kind of initial, for some reason my fingers want to make layer mixer nodes today. Parallel mixer, please. So we're going to do some primaries adjustments here. Maybe drop this down, maybe do a little bit less contrast, like so. Maybe do a little bit of balancing, whatever. There's our primaries. So down here in our parallel patch, or our secondaries branch, I should say, we talked about a couple of interesting things. We talked about having this parallel branch in general, and then we talked about our outside node. Here's a fun thing that I also like to do with outside nodes before we even look at other types of nodes. So we talked about okay, if I want to window and perhaps soften the skin on my subject's face, for example. Maybe we go over here and do that, -10, whatever. Then we do an outside node, Option O. And you can see I've got this matte, this blue dotted line connecting me from node 2 to node 4. Node 4, by default, is going to give me everything that I didn't have control over in node 2, right? It's an outside node. It's instead of inside of the window, I'm operating on the outside of the window. Now, here's something that I actually really like to do. As you guys know, I'm a big believer in simplicity. I'm a big believer in fundamentals. I'm a big believer in getting stuff done in primaries if I can, rather than resorting to secondaries. However, that's not always possible, and especially when you're doing commercials. That's the realm of commercials is secondaries, because really what is wanted in a lot of cases there, anytime there's a product that's being put on display, we want to really pop that product and do pretty explicitly non-photographic things to it. And we want to do more things that are bordering on like actually being visually graphical and sort of like hyper stylized, hyper simplified, and hyper legible for the consumer, right? So that's just kind of the domain of advertising and commercials, is we're going to be working in a bit less of a sort of photographic cinematic mode often, and we're really in the business of selling something, right? Of making something appear as idealized and as prominent and as sort of distilled into its essence as we can. So that may mean we need to go off the reservation of like making normal photographic corrections. And what'll often happen in that case, I don't have a great image in this timeline necessarily to demo. I mean, actually, let's use this fruit here. So what will often happen in that case is you'll find yourself fixating on whatever the product actually is. Let's say it's this bowl of apples up here. You'll find yourself starting with like, okay, well, I mean, let's actually, as long as we're here, let's actually get a better balance on this. Like that feels much better on balance. Get a little more separation there. But once you're in on your secondaries like this, you'll find you're fixating on things, and the client may say like, hey, we really want to boost the saturation. Okay, we'll boost the saturation. And then they'll say, okay, yeah, but we really want to sharpen it a little bit as well. We'll say, okay, we could do some mid-tone detail maybe, or we could do, like some negative blur, different things we could throw at that. But they'll say, okay, we really want to sharpen it. And then they'll say, well, the green apple in the bowl doesn't feel quite right. What can we do about the green apple? And they could even say like, oh, we actually want to correct all of the reds in this image. We want to like rotate them a bit more primary or whatever. There's a point for me where like in the same way that I talked this week about a node being an idea, there's a point for me where it's like, well, just because it's all happening inside of this window, it doesn't really mean it's all necessarily one idea, right? Like I just hit on what by my measure would be idea like 3 or 4, all of which happen to just be contained inside of this power window. But it doesn't make it any easier for me to have all of those ideas clustered into one node, or to have them all disappear and reappear when I'm auditioning the node off and on. So I'm going to show you another way that I love to use outside nodes. If we go over to node number 4, which I've created as an outside node, I'm going to go over here to the key palette right here. And this icon right here, this is actually what's creating the outside node. This is what's actually flipping the image from being inside to outside. If we turn this around, or turn it off rather, now I am just continuing to operate on the inner contents of this window, which I find really helpful, especially in an advertising mode where we are probably going to fixate on one or more small portions of the frame and want to do something, and then do another thing, and then do another thing on top of that, and then another thing. And there's a point past which doing it all in one node doesn't make sense for me in terms of being able to easily read what I'm doing. And it also doesn't make sense for me in terms of like quickly showing the client what we're doing and saying like, all right, we tried that sharpening thing, but let's try turning it off, but we like the saturation. Well, of course I can't do that very easily here in node number 1 without finding that sharpening and zeroing it out manually. It would be much better if that was living in a separate node at a certain point, so that despite the fact that it's all happening on one sort of windowed area of the frame, I can isolate each of the things that I'm doing to it in turn. So I call this maneuver like turning the outside node inside out. So if you want to just continue to operate on a mat that you've selected, or here's another variation, once you sort of put yourself in the mode of like, it's almost like, again, I feel like most of this applies for me to advertising. I think a lot about like, it's almost like you're grading everything in miniature. It's like you're, I don't know, it's like you're like staging a scene inside of a snow globe or something. It's like most of the energy, most of the time, most of the intent in a given shot is often going to go into the portion of the frame where the product is living, right? So we're going to spend a ton of time on this window or a similar one. So what you can even do is I could add a third outside node. Again, flip the outside node inside out. And then if I wanted to, if I'm still wanted to stay within this window domain, I could actually add another window. Maybe we want to work on the green apple specifically, right? Or, you guys won't believe I'm saying this, but I could do a qualifier within this same chain of sort of like isolated adjustments that now no longer have to live in a single node. It's almost like I've got a whole branch. I've actually done this before. Well, I will have a whole dedicated branch of my parallel node stacks that's just dedicated to one mat and to like sub manipulations and sub mats and sub qualifications within that single master mat. And again, as I talked about in this week's video, I really like having it all be driven by one master mat, so that if we decide, you know what, that softness is actually causing the operations to bleed too much, I can choke it all in, and now nodes 4 and 6 are all being adjusted automatically on that basis. So, like that's sort of another way that I will expand on outside nodes often. It's like, all right, I want to operate on the outside of the inside, the outside of what I was just working on. But it can also just be a matter of like, all right, I'm starting to go really deep on this one area of the frame, and I want to just, for my own sake and for the sake of auditioning stuff, start to break those things up into sub adjustments, even though they're all happening inside of one power window or mat that I've drawn. So that was one thing that kind of came to mind as we were talking this week. Rafa, how are we doing out there? Should I keep spinning up ideas on my side?
We have 4 questions, 2 about LUTs and 2 about node graphs. Which ones do you want to address first?
Let's hit the node graphs, man.
All right. From LeFrancois Emerson, something like that. About the splitter combiner, what is the interest creatively? I know it is manipulating RGB channels separately. What is the advantage versus the RGB mixer tool?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we're gonna go to, we're gonna get a quick color science undergraduate here. If we look at, let's just kind of simplify stuff for now. So Emerson is asking about the splitter combiner and about kind of what the creative benefit of this might be. There's lots of different ways that we can use this, but one that I often will use it for is if I'm doing, I'll use it in tandem with a color space transform into a different model. So if I want to, for example, gosh, what am I working in? I think I'm in Airy today. I'm going to go like into HSV. Something like this. Turn all this stuff off. Do an inverse transform on the other side. Like so. So we're doing it. We've got a net neutral round trip. As you guys know, I'm always obsessed with confirming that that's the case before I start to actually operate inside of whatever sandwich that I've made here. And within that, I'm more likely to, like, as Emerson says, it's like, well, whoop-de-doo, you have a dedicated node for operating on your red channel or on your blue channel or whatever. Like, I suppose that could be interesting, but generally speaking, if I want to operate just on my red, I'll play with my red curve, or I'll play with my, red gain or whatever. I don't necessarily see a need for having a separate node. Sometimes it can be helpful when you're in a separate model like this of like HSV to now just have a dedicated channel for your saturation. For some reason, I find it a little bit easier to like delineate that, or I find it more helpful to have that delineated for me, I should say. So like right now, I'm increasing the gain on my S channel, channel 2, what would be my green channel, but because I'm in HSV, I'm increasing the S channel. So I'm linearly expanding out the saturation of my image inside of this HSV model. And some of you guys may have heard before, this is often sort of like this exact idea or a version of it is often touted as like, here's how you get subtractive color inside of Resolve. And that's actually not wrong. This is a sensible way to get color that feels like it is not increasing in luminance as it increases in chroma or colorfulness, which technically have separate definitions, but then so does saturation. And we actually use that in the complete wrong context, like 99.9% of the time. But at any rate, for whatever reason, for me personally, I will often find myself like using a splitter combiner node to break things out in that way. And you can also do like really fancy, more intricate stuff if you want to start to create interactions or play channels off of one another in some form other than just linear gain. Because like in the RGB mixer, as we alluded to here, this is just linear gain being applied. So it's like a gain of certain amount of red, certain amount of green, certain amount of blue in the red channel. But if we wanted, for example, to apply a combination or a crosstalk curve, we could even say of red and green and blue, we could actually do that. Like let's try that out for a second here. What if instead of adding some green gain to my red channel, which I could do by going to my RGB mixer and doing that, what if instead of that, I wanted to add a custom green curve to my red channel? Well, in that case, I could go into here and go to my green channel here, and I could now add a sort of like custom green crosstalk shape in my red channel. So it's sort of like an RGB mixer on steroids would be another way that you could use this. You can create more complex sort of nuanced, nonlinear interactions between those channels than you're able to with the linear gain operations of something like the RGB mixer. So a couple of ideas for you there anyway.
All right, we have a question from CM Kumar, and he wants to know some uses for the layer mixer from a senior colorist like you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I use the layer mixer. One way that I use it a lot actually is as a way of performing highly visual math. So like as we just sort of explored by like, hey, let's rebuild a parallel mixer using layer nodes. That's one of many examples where I will like quickly audition something by performing math on it using the layer mixer. So that sort of bleeds into more of the look dev image science side of my practice, I suppose. But another way that I will often use layer mixers, I'll give you a good example here. Let's go over to my timeline level, and I'll actually, like, let's look at my gamut. Actually, I take that back. Let's turn all this off, and I'm going to go to, I'm just going to add a different LUT here. I'm going to add one that I just finished making a while ago that I really dig. Although this is, let's see here. Let's do this by the book. I'm always barking at you guys about doing proper color management. Let's do some proper color management, huh? I'm going to go in and set up some proper DaVinci Wide Gamut intermediate color management. Same thing that I do in the DaVinci Wide Gamut workflow series if I'm going too fast for you to follow all the twists and turns here. So I've got that set up. This is going to look a little crazy for a minute. And I'm just going to set this and everything else to input as area log C. Maybe. This is a bug in Resolve 17 that for some reason I can't always tag everything with one input in a single stroke. At any rate, we are now in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, so I'm applying this LUT properly. And while we're at it, let's go to an image that I find more compelling. So maybe something like that, okay? So with this LUT applied, one thing that I could do that I will often use my layer mixer for is if you want to start to play around with like decoupling and, like tuning a look LUT that you're using, you can use a layer mixer for that in a number of ways. One really good one is to put the LUT on top and bottom node. And then if you set your composite mode to color, and then you go down here to say your bottom node, node number 6, and you start to play with your key output gain, and you pull that way back like so. Oh, you know what, guys? This is funny. I actually discovered this quite recently. There is a problem with layer mixers inside of color management set up at the project level. We discovered this during the Colorist Career Accelerator. Any of you guys there? Remember that? We discovered it on the fly, and I was like, what the heck is happening there? The layer mixer actually acts funky when you are color managing at the project level. So that's actually a great thing to note. Be mindful of using the layer mixer in color managed workflows when you're color managing in that way. For now, I'm going to color manage manually just so we can emphasize this point. We're going to go area Alexa, area log C, DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate, and none of this stuff. And then we're going to set our output transform to go with that. So we're going to say DaVinci Wide Gamut, DaVinci Intermediate, like so. Okay, so we're exactly where we were a moment ago with my project level color management. I'm just doing it in nodes so that my layer mixer will behave itself. Okay, so if I now look at adding that back in there, like so, let's look at manipulating the underlying layer here. So you can see what I've got here. That might have been operator error when I was working on this lower node in the first place. But in this color mode, what this allows me to do is to scale the contrast and the color components of my LUT separately. That's what I'm driving at here. So if I take this key output gain on node number 6 down to 0, now I'm only getting the color character of this LUT and none of the contrast. Can you see that as I flip this off and on? Let me make this a little bit bigger for you guys. I'm trying to remember to do that these days. So you can see I'm just getting the color characteristics of the image. And conversely, if I scale this, or better yet, even easier way, I can flip these, and instead of my composite mode being color, I can set it to luminosity, and now I'm getting just the contrast and none of the color remapping on the image. All right, so that's one way that I, maybe not as much these days, but it's a way that I've used layer mixers a ton in the past when I would like rely more, for example, on like a print film emulation LUT, like a color management friendly print film emulation LUT. I would use it to decouple the color and the contrast and sort of scale and tune both to taste. And I often wouldn't scale number 6 here. I wouldn't scale either of them to 0, but I would just scale them up or down sort of by eye, so that if it's like, all right, I want to get a little bit less contrast here, but all of the color, I could get that, you know, by doing something. Or actually, I would have to flip my composite mode back to luminosity, or add a second node down here maybe. So now I'm getting just the color and none of the contrast stuff. So you can play with layer mixers as a way of like decoupling and tailoring and tuning a LUT that otherwise you don't have much kind of access inside of, if that makes sense. I hope that's spurs some creativity on your part in terms of working with the layer mixer, but that's a couple ways that I will use them. That's more common. I don't use them a ton in my day-to-day grading workflow at the moment, though as many of you observed, that's what I was saying about parallel mixers before I started incorporating them. So maybe that'll change tomorrow or in a week, who knows?
Okay, a question from Nathan. Could we assume that the core LUTs elements, the core elements LUTs will go after the parallel/layer node? What if we apply the tone curve and the gamut in a parallel stack?
That's an interesting idea. I don't think you would end up in that case really seeing much difference, although your mileage might vary. Like if we just do a quick test, it's like, okay, let's do 3 versions of a tone and an elements, or a tone and a palette LUT rather. So what we're going to do in all cases is we're going to use winter. That's what I did here, right? Yeah, we're going to use winter and snow as our respective tone and palette. I'm going to go ahead and label these. So we're going to say tone, and then we'll say palette. Misspelled, which is going to drive me crazy, but I'll try to live with it. So right now we're doing tone and then palette, right? Let's just audition some things side by side. This is something that I do all the time when I'm setting up looks. It's like, all right, let's have a shootout, you know? So that's tone and then palette. I'll show you guys a cool trick you might already know about. I'm going to tap on node 5 here and hit E. That's going to pull it out of the stack. And then I'm going to hold down Shift. Or actually, I don't even need to do that. I'm thinking about Fusion. Then I'm just going to drop it into the node tree downstream. So now I'm doing palette followed by tone. And if we compare, it's a pretty slight difference. Let me make sure that I'm getting a full frame wipe here. If we compare, that's a pretty slight difference, but that's a difference, right? So this would be palette followed by tone. And now let's try Nathan's idea of doing a parallel node. Let's see here. I'm going to copy this, delete that, parallel, and then paste down here. So that's indeed different than palette and tone. And it's also a little different from tone and palette. So whether it's wildly different, I'm not so sure. It probably depends on the image and on the combination of LUTs that you've selected. But I actually think that's a pretty cool idea. And to answer the very first part of the question, yes, this would, if you were going to do something like this, I would do this as a completely separate, like, here's what it would look like in my actual node tree. If this was all happening here inside the clip level as opposed to sticking this stuff elsewhere, even if it was happening here at the clip level with everything else, I would have it be a completely separate parallel mixer, if that makes sense. So I would still have my main operations happening like so, and then I would send them all back together and then resplit in a dedicated fashion for the parallel mixer, just to kind of keep things organized and straight in my head, if for no other reason. So it's like, you know, something like this. I wish these didn't flip upside down when I clean up the node graph, but such is life. So I would do it some way like this, but that's actually a cool idea because we were getting slightly different results there. So yeah, that's something worth playing with.
Okay, let's go to subtractive colors from Nathan as well. Could you quickly show your method inside Resolve for getting subtractive colors? And why do you use DCTLs instead?
Yeah, that's a cool idea. So, I mean, here's, we can kind of riff on that for a moment since it doesn't seem like we're too backlogged with questions. Let's do this. This is my color space transform. Okay. So because we're going into more of a kind of like development context here, I am going to go back to just working in plain old Log C, like so. And let's talk about subtractive color. This is actually kind of a callback to our conversation about the layer, or the Emerson's question about the splitter combiner. Here's one way that I'd love to do subtractive color. If we do, let's see here. I'm going to do a new node. We're going to do a splitter combiner. And I'm actually going to wipe out the combiner here. And I'm just going to do this splitter so that I can get the, I actually want to get channel 3. I'm going to get the channel 3 of my HSV, which I'm going to produce right now in the same way that I did a moment ago. We're going to go HSV, log C, none of this other stuff, okay? And I'm going to label this as well because it's going to get just a little bit complicated. So we're going to HSV. This is sort of a separate branch all on its own. And I'm literally just going to HSV to get the V channel of HSV. And I'll explain why I'm doing that in just a moment. But after I've done this, I'm going to create a new serial node and a new layer mixer node. And this is all, or this branch anyway, is going to connect to the original. So here's how I get into what I could call like subtractive color space, so to speak. I'm going to simplify this as much as I possibly can. We've got the original image. We are moving into HSV solely to sort of pluck our V channel. I'm going to go to my composite mode here, my layer mixer, and I'm going to say subtract. So what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, create a, give me the V channel of an HSV conversion and subtract it from my base image, okay? Doesn't look like much yet. Here is where I'm gonna do stuff, okay? After I've done stuff, I'm going to create another layer mixer and I'm going to add back that same V channel. And I'm gonna set this composite mode to add. Okay, so once again, this is the exact juncture where I want to turn everything off, like reset the grade and undo that, just make sure, okay, because all I want to do right now is create a setup. I don't want any of this to move anything. I just want to be positioned so that I can move stuff. And indeed, that's what's happening. And now if I operate in stuff over here, I can do all kinds of interesting things. I can add gain. And that's going to give me some very subtractive feeling color, right? I can actually manipulate my trackballs in kind of an interesting way. What's going to happen here is my luminance is really not going to increase no matter what I do within here, because we can geek out about HSV for a moment since we're talking about it. What HSV is doing, the way that it defines its, this is actually even better if I use my gain for this operation. Let's go over to here. So you can see it's having a slighter effect, but like now I'm really getting that behavior of like nothing ever getting brighter than it started, right? What HSV is doing, the reason that happens is, this is a funny, a fun kind of deep dive into color science, but cool, fair play. HSV has a dedicated luminance channel, okay? There's different ways of defining luminance. The way that the HSV model defines luminance, what it calls value, is like, I'll give us a sort of like a broader context for a moment. The most common way, the most like video standard way of defining luminance is to say, well, we're going to define luminance as about 70% of the green channel and about 20% of the red channel and about 5, 6, 7% of the blue channel. Combine those, average those things together in that ratio, and that's a luminance channel. That's how, like, virtually anything that needs a luminance channel in Resolve, that's how it's calculating that luminance channel. So if we look at the preserve luminance checkbox in the RGB mixer, if we look at a saturation knob in Resolve, because if we're going to manipulate color, we got to get luminance out of the mix, right? That's like the standard video way of defining luminance happens in that way. There's also all kinds of interesting other ways of defining luminance. We can define luminance as, okay, take my red, green, and blue, whatever those values are, at whatever point a particular pixel is passing through the pipeline, and define luminance as the smallest of those three. That's another like, okay, well that makes sense because the rest of it must be color. Whatever is common to those three, that must be the grayscale, that must be the luminance, everything else must be color, right? It's kind of reasonable. The other way that we can do it, the way that HSV does it, is say, take my red, my green, and my blue, whatever input pixel is passing through the system at this particular point, and define luminance as the maximum of those three things. And you can now think about, if we're defining the luminance as whatever the greatest of our red, green, and blue is, and then taking that away from the image, that means that we've cut our knees off. You can even see it like when we initially did this exercise. Let me save this so that I've got something to return to. But if we save that and then wipe all this stuff out, what we initially got was basically black. The only reason we know that this isn't a pure black frame is because we can see a little bit of life here on the vector scope, right? So the HSV channel is subtracting whatever the strongest value from red, green, and blue is, it's subtracting that from the image, and then we're only operating on what's left. So that's why we get that subtractive feeling, because the only thing we're manipulating here is the very small, is the two minor channels, the lesser of the three channels, right? The two smaller of the three channels. That's why we get that subtractive feel. That's not the only way to get that subtractive feel, but that is a way to do it. Now, there's lots of ways I could talk about, or lots of reasons I could give you for why I use DCTLs, but one of them would be this. If you think about, okay, like this is the most basic setup I can possibly show you for subtractive color, okay? And then you think about like, I want to add more stuff or more features or more lanes for making manipulations on top of this. You can imagine that rather quickly operating on things in a node graph context gets messy. And really what you want is a couple of sliders that have all of this behavior happening under the hood, behind the scenes, out of the way. So that's like maybe the simplest reason why I use DCTL. And of course, you can also do things in DCTL that you can't do here in Resolve. Like the arithmetic that I can perform on the image is severely limited. I can perform addition, I can perform multiplication, I can perform division, I can perform subtraction, and then I can do some other sort of visually oriented math here. But I can't do power functions. I can't do piecewise functions. There's all kinds of other stuff I might want to do mathematically to the image that I can't do with a layer mixer. So that would be the other kind of key reason why I, at a certain point, got curious about DCTL and started developing for it. But this is a pretty good node tree right here. If you like set this up, and then you can, for example, do your balancing or do a creative look in a metric where you are not ever going to get brighter than what you started at, which is a pretty, pretty subtractive way of working in the most literal sense of the word. So I hope that's interesting.
All right. Question from Stephen Lee. Does working with fixed node trees make it easier to keep track of ripple node changes?
Of what kind of node changes?
Ripple node changes? The option to
rippled node changes.
Yeah.
I'll answer that in two ways. In theory, yes. For me, I actually don't ripple node changes ever. That's probably a little bit more OCD than like practicality would demand. I don't like the idea of rippling node changes. I don't like the idea of a bunch of changes happening at once that I don't see. So especially as I'm getting deeper into a grade, which is when you would generally want to ripple node changes, that's the exact moment when I don't want stuff happening that I don't supervise, in the same way that I wouldn't cut loose any old assistant on a project and say, hey, every shot needs to be cooled down by 5%. Just go in there and give me your best subjective take on that. I wouldn't do that either without having someone who I really trust in that position, because that's a very, the images are very delicate and can easily be bumped in the wrong direction. So on paper, yes. For me personally, what it actually, the fixed node tree allows me to do is to more quickly manually go through and go from one shot to the next and say, oh, we're backing that node off by 5 degrees, or we've got a rebalance for this scene that I'm going to kind of like paste into place. That's sort of how I would go about that. It's just manually rippling, if that makes sense. But frankly, in either case, even if you do want to automatically do it, then yes, a fixed node tree is going to make that a much more reliable thing for sure.
All right, a question from Jim Robinson. I like to use the outside node to make background darker after setting the exposure of the subject. It is better for you to brighten the subject or darken everything else?
I like your way of working, Jim. I will pretty aggressively prioritize the subject. There are cases where it's like, all right, if the subject is relatively small and they need just a ton of stop before I can get them where they want, it's possible I'll set a more general exposure level and then do a window and crank that up. That's very, very, very rare for me. What I will do 9 times out of 10, what my preference is exactly what you just said. I will prejudicially, aggressively set my exposure to best serve my subject, whatever I've determined or determined with my client is most important, and then create a power window and knock things down around them exactly as you said. I think that's I generally, as you guys know, I like to work windows in a negative context. I like to bring stuff down, not build it up.
All right, a question from David. If you render a master in DaVinci Wide Gamut, which codec and format will you use? DNX, HR444, 12bits, ProRes?
If I'm rendering a master without any display transform,
Yeah.
Gosh, I don't actually. I mean, my go-to thought there would just be to do linear EXRs. So just move that log curve into a linear metric. Other than that, to be honest, I've never done that before. So probably ProRes Quad 4XQ could do it, I think. Yeah, I believe that should work fine. I don't think anything would get clipped or overly subsampled or compressed in that instance. But my first preference would be to do either linear EXRs, or if I don't want to do linear, I would do like a TIFF or a DPX, like a lossless image sequence. That's going to produce a massive folder of many, many files, as you know, but that would be the bulletproof way of doing it for sure. And that's the way, like for VFX handoffs or something like that, which is the main context that comes to mind that I would actually be doing something like that for. That's definitely what I do, is just image sequences in a totally like lossless format.
All right, let's go back to lookup tables. When using the Colin Kelly Core Elements LUTs at the end of the clip chain, could those LUTs be placed in the timeline section if I wanted to apply the LUT to all the clips in the project?
Absolutely.
If not applied in the timeline, perhaps in the group post location if clips are grouped?
Yeah, you could do either of those things for sure. And in fact, I do one of those things for virtually every grade. I can't remember the last time I had a look living as like a pasted element at the individual clip level, just because it becomes more difficult to manage and it crowds the node graph. And as you guys know, I'm a big believer in keeping a tidy and minimalist node graph that I can like come back to in a week or a year and be like, oh yeah, exposure, contrast, balance, some secondaries down below. I see what I was doing there. I want it to be as legible as possible and as easy to navigate as possible. So I generally will offload, like macro level looks. The whole point of them is that they are a macro level transform. So I generally will offload them either to the timeline level or to the group post clip if there's some reason, like, I don't know, in a rare instance where I might have graphics or something in play that do not require a benefit from the treatment of a look. I'll do the look at a group post clip so that I always have the option of like excluding an asset from that group if for some reason it doesn't want or need the same treatment as everything else.
All right, another one regarding LUTs from Alminox. do you have a tutorial somewhere with settings and procedures for optimal YouTube HDR and required custom LUT for SDR down conversion delivery?
I do not have something like that. I have not done any HDR deliveries for YouTube. I remember like probably 5 years ago now doing some initial experiments with getting the tagging proper for doing HDR for Vimeo, just kind of as a test. But no, I don't have a best practices sort of like video or document on that. That would be interesting to do the research on and put together. And in terms of like that down conversion, I think what you're alluding to is the fact that YouTube allows you to send along a kind of sidecar LUT to get from HDR down to SDR. That's something else that I definitely would want to take advantage of if I were doing an SDR or an HDR rather delivery for YouTube. And I would probably start with that with just, like cooking a LUT of the SDR down conversion for whatever color management framework I'm using. So for ACEs, I would use a ST2084 1000 nit to 70900 nit transform, and similar for Resolve Color Management, just whatever resolved version of that is in the color space transform. As you guys may know, I'm a big believer in like a consistent and a sound technical transform to get, whether it's from camera space to display space or from one display space to another. I'd like to sort of, as much as possible, decouple the creative from the technical and have a technical LUT that does a sound job of preserving as best as possible the creative intent for display A onto the capabilities of display B. So yeah, that's I'm glad you brought that up. That's something I'll think about, but no, I don't have anything definitive on that at the moment.
Right. Another question from Josia. How do you manage nodes when clients want you to constantly switch between the version A and B of every little adjustment you make?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I would say that goes back to what we talked about in this week's video. That's exactly why I tend to iterate. Anything that a client's going to ask me for that in my mind they might want to see as a different thing, or even more so that I think of as a distinct visual idea, I actually want that in a separate node. Now, my counterweight to avoid the node bloat that I talked about in this week's video is, without being like contentious or bristly about it, I feel like part of my role in a color grade is to help guide the journey. So if we are, okay, let's do this. Okay, now do that. Now do that, Cullen. Now do that. Now do this. I'm very rarely just going to sort of blindly go, okay, I'll add a new node and I'll do such and such to it. If they really have a clear creative intent and that's really what they want, I've sat in those sessions before. But generally speaking, this is where the essence of a lot of the stuff that I talk about here on the channel and in my book come into play, where I feel like a big part of the skill that I've cultivated over the years is the ability to listen to a note, to understand psychologically and also in terms of like technically what they're asking for and what that's going to do on a sort of math level to the image, and offer the simplest possible version of that idea. And like that can take all kinds of different forms, but an easy example that just comes to mind, probably because we were just talking about it with Jim, is if we are doing our primaries and then we do adjustment A and then adjustment B and adjustment C above and beyond that, and they say, okay, that's looking great, but the subject is actually dark. Can we window them and bring them up? That's a new node and a new idea for sure, but I'm going to say, okay, interesting. So it sounds to me like we probably haven't set our exposure quite right for our subject. Would you agree? And if they say yes, then I'm going to go back to that primary node and get that right. So I'm always looking for, like, every time there's a new idea being thrown out, I want to make sure there's nothing that I'm doing to fight that idea in my node graph as it exists right now. That's my preference, is to go back and adjust a node that already exists and target a node in that form, as opposed to just, sort of like being a stenographer and trying to keep up with, like, okay, new node, every single time a note is requested. I've been in those sessions before, and, like, ultimately, if that's what it takes to get the job out the door, that's okay. But I really pride myself on being good, as I said, psychologically as well as technically, to say, like, well, that's interesting. What if we actually tried going back and sweetening something we've already done that may be working at odds with what you're asking for? So that's kind of how I think about that.
Right. Regarding the subtractive saturation node tree that we built earlier, can a complex node tree needed for the subtractive Technicolor process be recreated with a simple color generator and a subtractive layer node? Or do the results vary too much?
I would say many things are possible. I just finished a whole series on mixing light where we literally did exercises like we did with that subtractive node tree, where it's like every single new video is like, hey, here's another way we can do some fairly intricate math without ever leaving the color page. But a lot of that, kind of my disclaimer during that conversation was like, hey, most of this isn't really practical because the node graph is a mess, and finding the knob you need to twist to get the result you're after isn't going to be terribly practical. And certainly in the example you're talking about now, it's going to fall into that category. Like, you can probably get a lot of what you're talking about, all the complexity, all the nonlinearity necessary to do that. You can probably get most of it. There's going to be some compromises and some things you can't get, but you can probably get most of it. The problem is most is not all. And, I don't want 90% of the thing. I want all the thing. And in order to get that 90%, I'm going to create the world's most unwieldy, insane looking node graph that's just not practical. So it's a question of like, where does the use of the tool become suboptimal? At a certain point, it's, like when you're doing hardcore look dev in a node graph, it starts to become sort of the same idea as like, you could actually do a lot of compositing in Resolve. Like you can move in and out of linear space. You can draw mats. You can track things. You can do a lot of compositing type operations in Resolve, but there's a point past which it's like, this is not the tool for doing that. And I'm also not the operator for doing that. So I would say kind of the same thing when we're talking about look dev or modeling complex processes or stocks. It's like, all right, I don't have the tools, and I may or may not have the toolkit as the person making those adjustments to really do the best job of this in the least amount of time possible. So that's sort of how I would think about that. And my goodness, we've blown through another hour. I can take, we can do another one or two since we had a sort of odd start, if there are questions out there.
We have a question from Brennan Martinioli. So if you have multiple deliverables, let's say 709, P3, and HDR, where in the node stack do you set the trim pass?
I don't really think about it that way, to be honest with you. I have a target output, and then I'm going to generate a duplicate of that timeline. This is assuming I'm not doing a Dolby Vision thing. Okay, Dolby Vision thing, that's sort of its own deal, and I have a very simple approach for that as well. But let's just take the example of if I'm doing a P3 and a 709, I'm going to duplicate. Let's say we started with the P3, and then we're going to do a 709. I'm going to duplicate that whole timeline. Okay, I'm going to duplicate it, change my target output, and then I'm going to watch it down on the display that I'm now trimming or mastering for. And then I'm just going to take the wheel on my individual nodes and adjust those same core fundamental nodes for that deliverable. That's, to me, again, one of the benefits of like having such a minimalist node graph is I can just go in and say like, okay, the exposure just subjectively feels like it needs to open up ever so slightly, or the contrast needs just a little bit more snap for this like viewing context, whatever it may be. There's so few nodes in the node graph, and there's so much of the lift being done by the color management and the like look dev portion that it doesn't feel unwieldy and like, oh my God, I'm like, opening up, like the hood of a car that I'm afraid I'm not going to know where everything goes, and I'm not going to put it back together right. It's just, whatever, like 10 nodes is a lot of nodes for me. So if I can go in and find the right node in that stack, tune it for this deliverable in a separate timeline, that's the way that I like to handle trims. I don't like the idea of trimming for multiple display formats within one node graph. We can do another one or two here.
All right, a question from Sonka. Why the saturation and color boost didn't work as you intended? Can you talk a little about how saturation works inside Resolve?
Oh, I would love to do that. Absolutely. So here's how saturation works inside of Resolve. Saturation, let's do a quick sort of like image science lesson here. Optics, I guess I should say. If I have a red apple, here's a red apple. If I have a red apple and a hornet Do you guys see that guy? I think he just took a sip of my coffee. Anyway, if I have a red apple, in real life, let's just say, for the sake of argument, like when we say saturation, do we want to literally boost the chroma of this signal? Maybe. It's more likely that what we actually want to do is make this image appear as if the apple that was photographed was itself a deeper, more pure red, right? That's really the beef with saturation is like with video style saturation, it's a very sort of like engineering video metric where like, I just want to boost the chrominance of this signal. And when you want to do that, the saturation knob is a great choice. It's doing that for sure. The thing is, what I'm doing here does not agree with the laws of the physical world, right? Because an apple in real life, if my goal is to make this apple redder, what's going to happen? This apple, by definition, is going to absorb more light, right? It's going to reflect less light and it's going to absorb more. So that's why we tend to get so obsessed with the ideas of subtractive color, because as an object in the real world becomes more saturated, it becomes less reflective, right? So that's the fundamental beef with saturation and why we really need more than one term than saturation when we talk about these things, because saturation, colorfulness, chroma, those all have distinct definitions that we tend to use kind of interchangeably when we're talking about motion image mastering. But that's my whole thing is like, there's very rarely an instance where like if I want to just in an engineering sense expand the chroma of my signal, that's going to be for reasons of like color management, and that's going to be handled by my color management. If I, as the artist, want to increase what we generally call saturation, it's because I want it to appear as if the objects or a particular object within the scene itself had a more pure color to it, if that makes sense. So that's not the way the saturation knob works. Saturation knob works by adding strength to the derived chroma channel, and it doesn't derive its luminance in the same way as we were looking at, for example, with HSV. So let's just try an experiment here. Let's do saturation at 75, like so. And then let's, just one more time, since we've been making HSV sandwiches all day, let's do one more to close us out. We're going to go Alexa, log C, HSV, log C, no tone mapping, copy this, paste it, and go the other way around from HSV back to Alexa, double check that I've got a net neutral round trip, which I do. And now let's do something we talked about earlier. I'm just going to go to my green channel and I'm going to boost the gain on my green channel to 1.5. So that's the exact same amount of boost that we had a moment ago. Let me just make sure I'm doing all this right. That's good. That's good. And over in here, let's undo my luminance mixer. That's what I was missing there. So here is 150% saturation in HSV. Here is 150% saturation in normal video ass style saturation. Can you see the difference? The HSV one still isn't perfect, but boy, is it a lot better, right? It feels like the objects itself have more purity to them. Like they are reflecting less light and absorbing more, and they have more innate color to them, right? This just doesn't feel that way. This is the exact same amount of that signal being added. It's actually not that crazy much of a difference in a 2D vector scope, but boy, does it feel different, right? So that's a very, very cursory introduction to the world of how exactly do we perceive color, colorfulness, chroma, and saturation, and what are better and worse ways to model and to implement that inside of a color corrector. So many more variables, so many more things we could talk about. This is a lot of what we talk about in my creative color science courses, but that's sort of an appetite whetter in there for like some of the principles and ideas that start to become relevant more when we're trying to do a better job of getting more what we could think of as filmic, or really more organic, more photographic colorfulness introduced into our images. You guys are awesome. That was a great week this week, breaking down nodes, node graphs. I feel like we got to explore a bunch more about nodes and node graphs, and then even go a bit further and get a little bit geeky. So I hope everyone enjoyed at least 1 or 2 stops along the tour today. Always a pleasure hanging out with you guys for grade school. We'll be back next Friday. We'll be back on Monday with a new video, and we're going to talk about that video on Friday. That's going to be our cadence going forward. We'll get a grade school announcement out to you guys ahead of time next time, so you're not having to get the, hope you all got notified on your phone like, hey, Cullen's live, get in here. And then you did. Seems like that's what happened, so worked out well. But next week we'll get on a more regular cadence of announcements. And I don't think I have anything else to share with you all for today, except I wish you a very happy rest of your Friday, a really great 4th of July weekend. And I will see you guys next week. Everyone take care.